Welcome, you fortunate person. You are indeed a gentleman and a scholar for picking this channel, Life in the 1800s Newspapers, where I read to you the actual words from vintage newspapers. This is a compilation video of some of the best stories I've read so far, and today we happen to be in Walla Walla, Washington. I don't talk about the politics or the weather of the day. I look for the more unusual stories, and here are some of the best of them. I'll start out with the very first video I ever made when I first joined YouTube. It's a bit rough, I have to admit. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for watching. Welcome to Walla Walla and the very first edition of the Garden City Gazette, Walla Walla's old-time newspaper. This is the very first edition, April 14th, 1894. So pour yourself a steamy cup of tea and step back in time with me to hear the news of 128 years ago. Many of these places in Walla Walla can still be seen and enjoyed today. Here are genuine heirs of European estates, Frank, William, Henry, and Auguste Osterman, contractors of the city, have received 20,000 marks from the sale of part of the estate which falls to them in Germany. Brother Frank, after his visit with his homeland, said, "Yes, sir, my own home, just as natural as life. I was so happy I ran up to the carriage and climbed out on the cannon barrel to get close to it. I wanted to touch it. It seemed as though I could knock at the door and my mother would open it." Populated. The day has arrived, and sportsmen with their implements of their craft are leaving the city by squads and platoons. If reports from the battleground are true, the sucker and trout are being landed in large numbers, and the advanced guard of the gunners is ruler of all it surveys. Seated on the bough of a tree overhanging a shallow, still place in the river, the writer saw a man. He was armed with a rifle of a .32 caliber and seemed to be intently watching the level stretch of water beneath him. A moment later, he rested his gun against a limb just beneath his waist, took careful aim, and fired. Taking up a net attached to a long pole, he scooped up a beautiful bass. Upon examination, I saw that the fish had been shot through the head. You see, in the spring of the year, the fish like to get in the still, shallower water and warm up with the sun. It's no particular knack in shooting 'em, for they get as close to the top of the water as possible and just lay as still as one of them on the frontier. He had an easy address and introduced himself, not without avidity, but with reluctance, as C.W. Jackson of Corvallis, Oregon. The reporter, remembering the involuntary exclamation which had first attracted his attention, after some cursory conversation concerning his visit to the fair, observed that, "Those are pretty nasty war implements," thinking to draw the old man out. The impression that he had a story in him was not a mistaken one, for he replied, "That's what they are," and then followed by a narrative of an experience of his early life among the Indians. It is given in his own language. "Yer see," he began, seating himself comfortably on a bench, "it was along the summer and fall of 1855 or 56. I could tell the date by looking over some of me old books. I lived over in Oregon then, in the little town of Corvallis in the Willamette Valley. One day, the news came by Pony Express that the Indians were on the warpath and murdering the whites and running off their stock and burning houses and other bits of deviltry that only an Indian can think of. Of course, there were some regular soldiers at Fort Walla Walla, but the Indians don't care a continental for them. They would make monkeys out of them the first chance they had. Well, when we got the news, we were pretty badly excited. We knew that something must be done immediately. So a few of us decided to have a big meeting that night, and soon it got noised around all over town. And as soon as night came on, we got a drum and a fife and a flag, and we started down the street. Say nearly every man and all the boys in town fell in line, and we marched to the end of that street and then back again to an open square where a big fire had been lighted. Judge Thayer, Dr. Stone, and a few others were the speakers. While the men were speaking, Colonel Kelsey opened the book for signers of volunteers to fight the Indians. Judge Thayer was the first to put his name down on the list. He swore he was a fighter from Kentucky, and no Indian could scalp him. At the same time, he took off his hat and exhibited his head, which is bald as a turnip. Then everybody cheered for Thayer. In 3 days, a company of 100 volunteers was ready for marching orders. Judge Kelsey was placed in command. Dr. McSteeny was made surgeon. The volunteers furnished their own horses and blankets, guns and ammunition where they had them. Those who had no war implements were furnished by those who remained at home. It was a motley-looking company of volunteers the morning Colonel Kelsey gave the command that every man should be ready to march at 12 o'clock. The men were all there, big men, little men, tall and short men. The horses presented about the same appearance as the men. The company was a young feller by the name of Van Hagerman. He had only arrived from the East about 2 weeks before the call for volunteers, and he was among the first to put his name down on the roll. He and I became fast friends at once. We became comrades, as they call it nowadays. Well, in due time, we got into the Walla Walla County and had several little skirmishes with small bands of Indians. The bulk of the Indians had given us the slip, and after trailing them for about a week without seeing any of them, we went into camp for 3 or 4 days to rest up and give our horses a respite. This camp was located about 15 or 20 miles below Walla Walla on the road to Wallula. We camped out about a half-mile from the Walla Walla River and all took our regular turns doing picket duty. I think it was about the 4th day in camp that Van Hagerman had gone on picket duty about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. His station was about 150 yards from the nearest point of brush that skirted the banks of the river. When the guard went to relieve Van, he couldn't be found, or at least he couldn't be seen. The guard went to where the pickets had always been stationed, and to his surprise and horror, there lay poor Van, deader'n a mackerel, with one of them dern pesky arrows sticking right through him. Of course, the camp was aroused immediately, and everybody was swearing vengeance. We buried poor Van right where he fell, and we put a few wild cherry poles over and around the grave. About 2 weeks after that, our company and the regulars located a big band of Indians about 4 miles below Walla Walla in the brush on Mill Creek. Here we had a hard 3 days fight. Old P.P. Mox, the war chief of the Walla Wallas, Cayuses, and Umatilla, was in charge himself. The soldiers and volunteers dug rifle pits behind big bunches of sagebrush and fired from these pits whenever they got a glimpse of an Indian. while the Indians were slicking with the errors in this embankment in front of the pits. Early on the morning of the third day, the volunteers crept out of those pits and crossed the creek about 2 miles below and came back on the opposite side, and before the Indians were fully aware of the change, the boys turned loose their guns right into the camp. Many Indians were killed that day, and of course there were volunteers killed and wounded by those pesky errors, and that fight virtually settled the Indian War. Old P.P. Mox was killed 2 weeks after that in a fight with some volunteers over near the boundary line of Oregon and Washington. A few years ago, I was up through that country, and I visited the spot where poor Vanderhagman was buried. A few pieces of poles and a deep indication in the ground is all the marks of that resting place of my murdered friend. He came from Missouri with the immigration tide. He was alone, without one blood relation on this side of the Rocky Mountains, and in less than 3 months after his journey across the plains was ended, he was killed. Those error heads are quite a curiosity now. They used to be very common, and there are plenty of them yet if you know how to look for 'em. Any of those mounds in front of those rifle pits I just told you about will have some of those flints where they were shot in the bank that sheltered the whites. As he finished the narrative, the sturdy old Indian fighter wiped the beads of perspiration from his forehead, caused by the excitement of reviewing the past, and rising he said goodbye to the reporter, saying, "If you ever come to Corvallis, drop in on us. Anybody can tell you exactly where the Jacksons live." He was joined by a sweetest old lady imaginable, with a face as smiling and eye as bright as any girl's, but whose hair, hanging down in old-fashioned ringlet, was a snowy white, as was her husband's beard. The charming old people are visiting relatives in the city and will return to Corvallis today. They are greatly taken up with the fair, and is much greater affair of its kind than they have ever had the opportunity of seeing. Ed Gillespie, a tough who had sold liquor to the Indians, pleaded guilty Saturday and was sentenced to 60 days in the Walla Walla County Jail. James Collin, who was charged with selling liquor to the Indians on the Yakima Reservation, has been released, as the jury could not find aught against him. The Mint Saloon on East Main Street is now under the management of Frank Wolf and William Preston. Tuesday night, the saloon was formally opened under new management, and a fine lunch was spread for the patrons of the place. Looking after the dollars. It is all right to look after the dollars, but if you are really desirous of saving them, you will exercise a little foresight and buy your furniture at Davis Kazer's. New 8-foot oak extension tables, polished top, $10. Bedroom suites from $14 and up. Thursday evening, a thief entered the farm residence of Chris Mayer and, taking the keys from Mr. Mayer's pocket, opened the safe and took $80 from it. The thief escaped. There are going to be some interesting football games here before long between Whitman College Club and outside teams. Spokane and Seattle are on the list already, with others to follow. New boat on the Snake. Captain Bowman went down to Riparia yesterday to superintend the finishing touches on the new steamboat, the Lewiston. The new boat has been launched and will be ready for service in about 10 days. Captain Bowman says she's a handsome craft and the finest boat ever on the Snake River. She is the same size and capacity as the old Annie Foxton, but of a lighter draught, and will be under Captain Bowman's command. Where did you get that hat? Will not be used as a term of ridicule, but rather as an expression of admiration and respectful curiosity if you buy your headgear of Al Goldman. You may follow the prevailing mode or suit your individual tastes for a very slight outlay. He has everything in stock, the latest shapes in every conceivable size at the lowest possible prices. Reads like a romance, the thrilling story of Convict Devine. The confession of John Devine, convict number 994, an escapee, who was recently recaptured, has just been made to one of the guards. Devine's story is as thrilling as the tale of a most lively romancer. About 1 year ago, the overseers under whom Devine was working noticed that the man was subject to extreme nervousness. A report was made from his odd behavior, and an order of commitment was accordingly procured, and he was sent to the Medical Lake Asylum. Devine's conduct at the asylum was not such as to excite distrust. But in June, the attendant in this ward was knocked down when the discovery was made by the superintendent and an invoice taken of the patients. Devine was found missing. A decomposed human body was a few weeks later found in the Spokane River. Its description tallied with that of the escaped patient. The matter was reported to Medical Lake and Walla Walla, and Devine was put on the record as insane, escaped, dead. However, about September 25th, a telegram from the sheriff of Yakima County announced the capture of Devine alive and kicking. The ex-convict, ex-patient, and ex-escapee was made prisoner and brought back to Walla Walla. Saw snakes. Jim McRae, an ex-bartender, was found on the street Sunday morning by Marshal Haley in an apparently demented condition. He had imbibed too freely for some time before and could see more snakes in a given time than any other man in town. McRae was taken to the hospital Monday morning, but became so violent that he had to be removed to the county jail. Dr. Keeler was called and gave a scientific name to the man's affliction, which in simple terms would read tremens.